fructose corn syrup in our food. So if we're looking at ingredient lists, these are just some of the top ones to avoid. And I mean, if you read ingredient lists of a lot of, if you went down the aisles and looked at the frozen food aisle, and if you looked at the snack food aisle, you're going to find a lot more ingredients on those things that are not listed here. But these are some of the most common ones. And the ones that I have found are the ones that really play havoc with our metabolic function in our body. So they usually create a spike in blood sugar, or they otherwise interfere in the mitochondria of our cells so that we're not really utilizing energy properly. And so these are, you know, what I would say the top ones. So refined sugars, obviously, and we're going to get into that in a little bit later in the slides of refined sugars. I listed here, you know, some, you know, beet sugar. We get sugar from several different places. Sugar cane used to be the main source of refined white sugar in our food supply, but now the main source of sugar is beets. There's a white beet, they call it a sugar beet, and they're grown specifically to make refined white sugar. So whether you see beet sugar on an ingredient list or you see cane sugar on an ingredient list, they're basically the same thing. They get refined down into that white crystalline sugar. And there's, you know, basically it's just sucrose at that point. Agave, which at one time, I would say maybe 10 years ago, and even I was kind of duped by it at the time, it used to be considered a healthy sweetener because it was actually high in fructose. And one of the things we know about fructose is that it doesn't work the same way in our body as glucose does. So glucose is sort of like the main sugar that we use for energy, and it's what signals our body to release insulin whenever we consume anything that breaks down into glucose. Fructose is different. It doesn't elicit an insulin response, but it goes directly to our liver, and there it starts to convert either into glucose, or it may even convert into fat, depending on how much of it is being consumed. So it's really, you know, fructose is considered to be a lot more harmful sometimes even than glucose. And agave was found to actually be high in fructose. And then we found out that it's actually created, the syrup of agave, for the most part. There are some types of agave syrup that are made a little bit differently, and they probably are a little healthier. They're just harder to come by. But in the main commercial production of agave syrup, they use the root of the agave plant, not the leaves. And the root is like this big starchy root. It looks like a great big pineapple that you know is sitting underneath the ground. So they take that root and they do the same thing to that they do to corn to make high fructose corn syrup. They just take this starchy root and they add enzymes to it and break it all down into simple sugars, fructose. And then you have an agave syrup that is high in fructose, just like high fructose corn syrup is. So we found out after a while that agave wasn't as healthy as we thought it was in the beginning. And then there's something called evaporated cane sugar that I think a lot of people think that's healthier than regular refined white sugar. And really it's only probably maybe 1 or 2 steps less processed than going all the way to white sugar. It's really not a healthy sweetener in the way that it sounds like it is. One of the things that I learned is that the food industry uses a lot of terminology to trick people. The trick that they play on the consumer ignorance, meaning, and when I say consumer ignorance, I just mean that people just aren't aware. They don't know these things. You know, a lot of times people just don't have the time to really get up to speed on all the different things that are going on in the industry. And so the industry will throw out a word here or there that makes it sound like it's something that's different than what it actually is. In fact, the High Fructose Corn Syrup Association, by the way, there is such a thing. It's called the Corn Refiners Association. And they actually petitioned to the FDA after high fructose corn syrup got such a bad rap. They petitioned to change the name. They wanted it to be changed to just regular corn syrup because they felt like people would not be as afraid of it at that point. So they're always the food industry is always sort of looking for a way to play on the fact that people are not paying attention, or they're triggered by words a lot of times. So it's kind of like with the gluten-free, when that whole thing came out, every product that could potentially put the word gluten-free on it was doing so, because they knew that the buying public was thinking that, oh, if it's gluten-free, that must mean it's healthier. So, I was seeing, it was really kind of funny, but, I was seeing things that never had gluten in it to begin with were claiming gluten-free. And that was just based on a consumer ignorance, because people didn't know that it didn't have it in it even before that. So that's what I mean when I say that. Looking for all the different refined flours. So there's a little section later in the talk here where I'll go through some of the terminology for what constitutes a whole grain flour versus what is a refined flour. But anytime you see the word enriched in front of the word wheat, that means it's a refined flour, because if it has been refined, it means it has had some nutrients taken out of it through the refining process. And then there's a law that was established in World War II that requires the manufacturers of white flour to add back in some synthetic B vitamins, because people were going deficient during that time. The soldiers US soldiers and the British soldiers were all getting deficient in vitamin B1, B2, and B3. So at that time, both governments decided, wow, what can we add some B vitamins to that everyone eats? And so they figured, well, everyone's eating bread made from refined white flour, so we'll just add the B vitamins into the flour, not realizing that the B vitamins were in there to begin with. If they would have just left it intact, then that wouldn't have happened. But the reason why the flour got refined was because of shelf life. So if you have whole grain flour, it doesn't last as long, so it starts to go bad. So if you take all the nutrients out of it, then of course it will last a lot longer. It's all about shelf life and being able to have things last longer so you can make money. Rice flour is another one. It's basically usually white rice. So same thing with white rice. It's had its bran removed from the rice, and so that removes a lot of the vitamins. And then they grind it up into flour. So, that's a refined flour. And anything that is not whole grain, one of the things, if it's a whole grain product, it usually will say whole in front of the word grain, whatever grain it is. So if it's wheat, it'll say whole wheat. If it is rye, it would say like whole rye. So, there's some different terminology that happens there. Partially hydrogenated oil, or just hydrogenated oil. Sometimes it's pronounced hydrogenated. These are a type of oil that are man-made. Well, they take a regular oil, like say soybean oil, and then they chemically alter it so that it has a longer shelf life, and it will have a slightly different molecular structure, so that it doesn't behave the same way in our body. But these are known as trans fats. So, and I'm sure everyone has heard of trans fats before, but that's